exciting today. We have on this episode Dr. Ben Clark, who is a professor at the UO School of Planning, Public Policy, and Management. I've taken a couple classes with Ben Clark as a student, and that's how I got to know his work and became interested in these different cool projects that he's working on. A little bit of background on Ben. So he received his BA in political science from Indiana University in Bloomington and later his master's of public administration at Syracuse, and then went on to do his PhD at the University of Georgia in Athens. So as a scholar of public administration and public management, he has been and lived all around this diverse country of ours, and presumably that's an important thing that comes through in his work and has allowed him to see different public agencies and how they operate in many different places in many different ways. I think he brings a nice perspective to the show, and I've asked him to talk about one line of work in particular, and that's the topic of co-production, when citizens and governments produce something together, when people work together to produce something. I'll let Ben give a fuller and better explanation of this term and what it means in a moment when I switch over to our recording. But I just wanted to say the reason why I chose this topic and why this episode is one of the first ones in the series is because I think it captures a major theme of the show of Applied Science Live, and that is this idea of being useful, and not only that, but using clever solutions, new innovations to make things that used to be difficult easier or better or more efficient. And I think the examples of co-production that we'll go on to discuss really highlight that. And not only this increase in efficiency and making things more effective for citizens of a town, for example, but also more equitable. And so um, we'll get into that in the last few minutes of the episode, the ways that some of these advancements in the ways people co-produce have made the provision of services more equitable, say for local governments. So without further ado, I'm going to load up our conversation, and pretty soon you'll be hearing from Dr. Ben Clark.
Co-production, generally speaking, is the idea of having your residents of, say, your city help a government to carry out duties that might have otherwise been done by them. Now, I'm just using an example of city because that's mostly what I focus on, but it's not necessarily just like a city thing. Governments at all levels can carry out co-production, and there's actually a co-production literature in the business world as well, where people will collaborate with businesses in a similar way. Um, and it takes on a lot of different forms. And so the type of co-production I look at is pretty a small piece of a wider literature. But again, to get to sort of like the meat of it, is having your residents of your city help you to by volunteering their time, their energy, their brains,
Mm-hmm.
in some way, shape, or form to help carry out something. So this might be as simple as people showing up at the elementary school to read to kids. Right, that's a very traditional view of co-production. You're helping the education of kids in your city, and it might be that your kid is in that class, but it might be that you just retiree, you got some extra time, you want to help out. This same kind of thing might happen at a hospital as well. You kind of go in and you kind of help to hold the babies and do stuff like that. Now, that's sort of a
Mm,
little bit of a gray area in the US because our hospitals generally aren't public, but some of them are.
mm,
While
mhm,
there's a lot of literature in the co-production realm from European countries where that is a much more clear example of co-production because a lot of the hospitals are run by a national health service of some sort.
mhm, mhm,
And in the modern era, what I have been writing a lot about is co-production through the use of information technology and trying to find ways in which we can use technology to engage the public to help solve problems that government has. And so my focus has primarily been in the realm of 311, which is a non-emergency version of 911, where you would uh, call in and say, there's a street light out or a pothole or a dead raccoon or something that we need some help with. And so you're providing the co-production service there is that you're providing the government with information and intel on where the problem exists and the severity of the problem. And so 311's been around for more than 20 years now, uh, as a formal sort of piece. But more recently, probably since the advent of smartphones, there have been smartphone applications that tie directly into that, and also web portals that provide another channel in which people can engage with their cities, providing information on where the problems exist in the city.
So it sounds like these more old school ways of doing things, the traditional kinds of co-production that we'd think of with a landline and dialing 311 have sort of morphed into this more 21st century style. Is that sort of what you're saying?
Exactly. Yeah.
So with that, I guess my mind goes to this question of what makes people buy into this system? Why do some folks take time out of their day to co-produce to help contribute to the public good?
Yeah, so there's not any places that I know of that have set up an incentive system real explicitly beyond the fact that you no longer have a pothole, or you no longer have that dead animal rotting. A lot of it. I mean, there's within co-production there's sort of a sense of two different sort of big motivators. One is sort of a selfish motivation that I'm contributing to this process because I want my life to be better,
Mm-hmm.
and then another one that sort of talks about it, from a more community oriented perspective, that I want my community to be better.
Mm,
And I think there's a little bit of both of that with the 311 example, where you may use it to report, again, a problem that's right outside your house because you want to have that solved. And 311 makes that a lot easier because you no longer have to be like in the old days of the phone book, flipping through the blue
right.
section of the phone book and trying to figure out which department handles what, and then you get rerouted 12 times and leave a voicemail.
Sure.
Through the 311 and the mobile apps and the web portals sort of provide some accountability on that side. Um, but it, again, why people specifically use it, again, it's sort of going to vary, and I think some people are much more selfish in it, and some people are much more sort of altruistic about it, and then there's others that are sort of a mix of the two.
Sure.
Um, and so trying to kind of figure out what the motivation is, I think there's a lot of room for experimentation
Mm,
on that front to really start to understand how can we get more people to use it. I think one of the things that I've seen in my literature that's probably the clearest sort of motivator that sort of come out of the data that wasn't necessarily right in my face from the start is the idea of self-efficacy that gets built into the process. So if a user starts to see that their their efforts are being rewarded by prompt response by the government, and they're dealing with the problems,
mhm,
that they will be much more likely to then use it again and again. So you kind of get in this like, well, this is something that's helpful, I'm going to continue to do it. And also sort of see a diffusion of this idea to people who live around you. And so we're actually able to measure that through some survey data in San Francisco, where like if you live in a neighborhood that has a high number of people that are frequent users of the 311 service, you're much more likely to be a frequent user or just a user generally, even. And so people are telling each other, or at least that's sort of my interpretation of what's going on there. Like they're telling each other that yes, this is something that works. And therefore they're going to tell their friends that it works, and then they're all going to use it. And so the trajectory really in pretty much every city that I've seen, the growth of the number of reports is not flat. It's very exponential in its
Mm,
shape. So people are using it more and more and more.
very
Uh,
cool.
it,
Yeah. So it can kind of catch on and become sort of use the power of social norms to sort of propel itself forward a bit.
exactly.
And so you mentioned San Francisco, and I was kind of curious as you were talking from the researcher's perspective, when it comes to sort of accessing some of these data, the from a new app or something like that. Um, are is this something that's publicly available, or do researchers have to set up special partnerships and go in and sort of sketch out a plan, or how has that worked for you?
Well, for the most part, the data I've used has been all public. My first study that I did on 311 was with the city of Boston.
Mm,
And this is an article published in the Public Administration Review in 2013 with Jeff Brudney and Sungil Jang. And so in that article, we actually got the data from the city. Like I'd had some email and phone conversations with them, and they provided the data set.
mm,
But since then, they've put their data online, and anybody could go and replicate it. I think the only reason one might in a lot of instances need to actually engage with the city is to better understand the data,
mhm.
or to get access to additional fields in the data set, because oftentimes they want to make the reports anonymous. So if somebody puts their name in there, they don't want to post that on the website,
Right.
or in the open data portal, and so that will be removed. You can potentially infer who some of these people are if you happen to know the neighborhood and where the reports are
Mm,
coming from.
mhm.
But we've worked on a study, or working on a study right now of 20 different cities around the country, and all of the data from those 20 cities are available online through open data portals, and you can just go in and download them and use them from there.
So when people do co-produce like this and chip in, I'm thinking about this term that's used, co-production. I'm helping my government by using my brain power, my ability to report something. Is there good evidence that help in this form does free up resources for a government, or that budgets are affected in positive ways when
Hmm.
there are apps and campaigns that encourage people to get involved? Is that something that you've been able to find out about?
Well, it's a little hard to measure, I guess, is probably the best way to put it. The specific kind of narrow question that we felt like we could actually ascertain from the data was wondering how the 311 reporting systems within Boston and San Francisco, as two case cities, how they may have or not changed budget allocations within the city budget. So by having more, say, pothole reports and more, I don't know, taxi complaints or whatever it might be to different departments that might deal with those kind of issues, does that change their overall budget allocation over the course of a number of years?
I see.
And we don't see any evidence of that. But that actually really follows the public management literature quite a lot, and the performance management literature. That we like to measure things, but we don't always incorporate that measurement of performance into budget allocations.
Mm,
And that's sort of the big gap. I think the takeaway we had from it is that the likelihood is that where we're looking is probably the wrong place for budget allocation. In that probably what is happening is that the distribution of resources within a department, so say your Department of Transportation, might get shifted because of 311 requests, but the mayor or the city council is probably not going to give that transportation department more money because they have more 311 requests.
Mm.
But 311 is used a lot as a measure uh, for uh, performance management, and so you'll
Oh,
see that in budget documents and performance audits and things like that quite a lot. So you can sort of see this evidence of co-production showing up and in different places in official documentation.
huh. Interesting. Um, well, so Ben, sort of looking at this body of work as a whole, taking a step back, what do you think are some of the most exciting future directions or sort of revelations that IT enabled co production might be giving way to? It seems like the way people co produce is transforming, and what are the implications of that, or at least what implications are you thinking about pursuing in your work?
Yeah, so I think it's really there's a lot of different ways I think that this could potentially go. I have plenty of ideas and not nearly enough time
Hmm.
to address them. Um, So, the projects that I've worked on primarily to date are trying to understand, how these new technologies and new ways in which they're used in co-production may be changing the face of the co-producer. And so, traditionally, the co-producer was an older white person of means with high levels of education.
Hmm.
That's sort of like the prototypical, often a retiree, So this is the person going in and volunteering in
Someone
school.
free during the day.
Yeah, yeah. They have extra time to do things, and they have, a level of education that allows them to potentially do some things that are maybe complicated. There's a wide range of what people do,
Sure.
but they have the ability to do that. Now, what we've found in the world of the IT enabled co-production is that it doesn't look like that.
Hmm.
But that actually mirrors a bit of the change in who is co-producing generally. So there's a number of surveys that have been done in Europe and in Australia recently that have shown that the typical co-producer today doesn't look like the one from the 80s and the 70s and even the 90s. That they are much more representative of their communities, and so sort of that general co-producer is changing to look a little bit more, but the IT enabled one looks a lot like their community. We haven't found systematic differences in different
Hmm.
cases that we've looked at there.
Hmm.
The study of the 20 city study is looking at how quickly cities are responding based on neighborhood characteristics, because
Ah,
there's some anecdotal evidence um, that cities were potentially responding quicker to the white neighborhood, to the wealthy neighborhood, that sort of thing. And we
sure.
wanted to really understand, is that the case? Is that something? Because we can measure it. We can look, and see
Uh-huh.
what's happening. And by and large, across all 20 of these cities, that's not the case. Though there are a couple cities that do have some demonstrated bias.
Hmm.
Um, but I think, having these kind of data allow a manager of a city, allow a mayor of a city, allow advocates within the city from the public to say, hey, you need to treat us all fairly.
Sure.
And so those are kind of unique questions that were really hard to measure before. You could say, we don't feel like our neighborhood's being treated fairly by the city, but you didn't have a lot of evidence to back that up. So I think there's, a lot of scholarship that can be written on that from the academic standpoint. But I think there's a real potential for civic groups to be able to use this kind of data to dive into those things as well.
Mm. Hmm.
Um,
Interesting.
so another project that I'm just starting and really just ran the statistics this week on it, planning on doing some presentations this year
Mm.
on my next co-production paper is trying to understand how people travel around the city and are they users of public transportation? Do they use active transportation modes? Are they driving alone? And how you get around, does that shape the way in which you might be likely or not likely to co-produce?
Hmm.
So a priori, kind of assuming that people with mobility challenges, we're going to be much more sensitive to infrastructure problems if the curbs cutouts aren't there for their wheelchair to get down, or the sidewalks broken, or the streets are in disrepair. Those kind of things are a much bigger challenge for somebody in a wheelchair.
Hmm.
than somebody who is not. Somebody who's on public transit has their hands free to report problems as they mosey around the city in a way that a driver of a car shouldn't be reporting something as they drive around.
Right.
And they're also exposed to the environment in a way that somebody in their own car, get into the car in the garage, drive to work in a parking garage. They just don't experience the world in the same way that somebody using public transportation or walking or biking or paratransit services would. And so what we've found so far is that in fact people who use public transit, people who use paratransit services are a lot more likely, particularly the paratransit folks, people who are daily users of that are about 6 times more likely to be a frequent user of 311 than somebody who's not. And that's kind of a really interesting finding for us that, and it kind of matches up with what we sort of supposed would happen. Uh,
Hmm.
but I
Hmm.
think it also for us, kind of from the city manager perspective, like here is a really good audience that you need to be mindful of and that you can engage with, and they're really likely to take off with um, this engagement, this co-production process in a way that somebody who's driving alone won't. And so if you want to market your 311 system to the people that are in most need, that are most vulnerable, then putting advertisements on paratransit buses is going to be a better investment of your time and energies than putting them somewhere else, and putting them somewhere that people ride bikes and walk. Again, a better investment than someplace some on the parking garage.
Sure.
Um,
Sure. Yeah, that's so exciting, and it makes a lot of sense. There seems to be this sort of democratic motion in these developments. Sort of those who for whom the system isn't working so well can speak up and let their voices be heard.
Yeah, and I think the technology is something that is really great for that. That it gives voice to people that may have been uncomfortable giving their voice before, that may not have either had the time, the ability to say go to a public forum to complain about the quality of their streets, but
Hmm.
they can anonymously or somewhat anonymously, depending on how they set up their system, report where all the problems are, and they can track and see how they're being dealt with in a way. Uh, that they couldn't before. That they don't have to call in and people hear their voices, and then they know that they sound this way and or that way, and feel like their voice will be heard more or less depending on how they sound to that operator. And so you
Sure.
can sort of take away those racial biases because it's sort of a blind system, and in a similar way that
Hmm.
like traffic cameras were supposed to do for policing, but you
Hmm.
no longer were getting a ticket because you were driving while black, but you were getting a ticket because you sped, and that ticket would apply to the white driver and the black driver, and the woman driver and the man driver. There was no differentiation. Um, and the smartphone applications and the web portals sort of provide that same outlet. In our study in Boston, we actually find some very small evidence that the smartphone applications were able to bridge the digital divide in some sense, that people, minorities in particular, were more likely to use the app than whites. But it was very early on
Hmm.
the uh, in the stages of that smartphone application. So I think that's a question we need to kind of come
Hmm.
back to and start to look at a little more carefully to understand that.
Sure. Yeah. And when were you doing that work in Boston? Was that?
That was like 20, 2010, 2011.
Okay.
I can't remember off the top of my head the exact years, but it was somewhere in that neighborhood. So,
Mm-hmm.
the iPhone had only been out for a few years
Mm-hmm.
at that point. And so there's certainly much more saturation and broader use of the technology today.
That's right. We'll end here on a little more jazz music. That's a great point I think Ben was making toward the end of our conversation there. It's going to be really exciting to see as smartphones become more and more popular and cities become more and more crowded, and we have to cooperate and work together and live on top of each other. And in the more populated societies of the future, um, just how important these sorts of applications and communication platforms become. And so this is, I think, an area of work to keep our eyes on as researchers, and also something to look out for just as consumers, citizens, people who live amongst other people, which we all do. So a huge thank you to Ben for coming on the show. I hope you all loved that as much as I did, and I'll send you out here with a nice smooth jazz music is what that is. I just want to say thanks for bearing with us here as we get our audio dialed in. We're new to this, so we're learning as we go, but I don't think the viewers will mind, the listeners will mind.